December 30th, 1951. Remember last year when the Incheon landings happened and the UN forces advanced northward along a broad front and they were going to be home by Christmas? Well, it's Christmas time once again, and they are still here in Korea. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, a new Soviet jet was spotted showing yet again that UN aerial supremacy is a thing of the past, though the peace talks continued with ever more issues concerning what to do with POWs. As we saw, a lot of the problems with the POW issue is because of the seeming inability of either side to give the other side accurate POW information. There is a huge difference between the number of UN soldiers listed as missing in action and the number the communists list as prisoners, and this causes the UN to seriously question the sincerity of the list. But the UNC was not blameless, since it had submitted more names of prisoners to the International Committee of the Red Cross at Geneva than it now had on hand. As it turned out, more than 2,000 POWs had been sent through the processing line twice, and the later lack of cooperation shown by many communist soldiers in providing information had made it difficult to correct errors. And of course, some enemy prisoners have escaped, which doesn't help the inconsistencies. So UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy requests a complete audit of all POWs so that at least he can and will give an accurate, complete, and up-to-date POW list to the other side. He's also, sort of in the background, having information gathered from Chinese and North Korean prisoners about how they feel about repatriation, and how the South Korean government feels about getting back South Korean civilians that are in enemy custody. This is all in aid of hopefully setting up a voluntary repatriation plan and not forcing people to go somewhere they don't want to go. But without having some idea of how many POWs would refuse repatriation or the general reaction of the South Korean officials to the whole principle, just going forward could make things awkward for UN command. Of course, the POW issue is not the only thing the delegations have to agree to or have agreed on. Remember last month when the line of demarcation was agreed upon for an eventual armistice, with the provision that the other items on the agenda must be agreed upon within 30 days or the line becomes invalid. The line they agreed on was based on current line of contact. Well, the 30 days is up now on December 27, and that day, UN Commander Matt Ridgway asks 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet to give a report on how and when he plans to go back on the offensive. Van Fleet's response shows how things have changed, at least tactically, over the past weeks. He says he has no plans for attacks in the near future. His lines, as they are strong enough to withstand attacks by the enemy, and minor attacks to make them stronger would be costly and wouldn't really give much value, especially related to the cost. The enemy's lines are strong enough to withstand normal artillery too, so only by a large and bold assault could they get the enemy out of current defense positions, which again would be costly, and to what end? There are just no benefits that justify the cost. Well, that is Van Fleet's conclusion. As for more ambitious plans, like an advance to the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, well, they get a pretty similar response. A study of such an operation by the Joint Strategic Plans and Operations Group shows that they do have the logistics to support such an offensive, and it's feasible, sure, but they estimate it would cost some 200,000 UN casualties. Good luck explaining that to the general public. Otto Whalen, Commander FEAF, Far Eastern Air Force, doesn't like that plan whatever the case because he does not wish to extend UN lines that far north and far closer towards the communist air bases in Manchuria. The Navy follows Wayland on this, that ships or amphibious forces could really be made to suffer by enemy air power if they move a lot closer to the enemy air bases. So it kind of seems that discussions of large-scale offensives at this point are really just academic exercises. They also have no idea how the USSR would respond to reigniting the war in a big way. I mean, as long as everyone is actually at the negotiating table and trying to settle the war without loads more killing, it would seem like they might frown on anything more than small-scale ground activity. The calm on the battlefield, however, did permit more attention to be paid to one troublesome problem that bothered the UN command almost from the beginning of the Korean War. Behind the lines in South Korea, there were over 8,000 guerrillas and bandits. 5,400 of them were reported armed. Concentrated mainly in the mountains of the rugged Chirisan area of southwestern Korea, they were a constant thorn in the side of the ROK government. Although they were chiefly of nuisance value, there was always the chance that in the event of a major offensive, they could pose a real and dangerous threat to supply and communications lines and to rear areas. As I mentioned a couple months ago, the guerrillas have stepped up their attacks against things like railway lines, and they are better coordinated. They're still not strong enough or organized enough to deal serious damage, but Van Fleet did decide that enough was enough and it was time to end the general threat. In November, the ROK 8th and ROK Capital Divisions, without their artillery, got together to become an anti-guerrilla task force. Starting December 1st, they were to go to work, and Phase 1 was to hit the mountains 30 kilometers northwest of Chinju. Phase 1 actually began with the South Korean government declaring martial law in southwestern Korea. That involved cutting off telephone talk between villages, imposing a curfew, and general restrictions on everyone's movement. Paik Sun-yup, who we've seen many times before, is actually in charge of this operation, which is called Operation Rat Killer. It's got a huge perimeter, 260 kilometers, and on the 2nd they begin operations, with ROK 8th pushing southward and the Capital Division heading north to meet them. The national police and security units were acting as blocking forces at strategic points to cut off escape routes. They did see some successes, and groups ranging in size from 10 to 500 guerrillas were flushed out. And there was not actually that much armed opposition. By the 14th, when Phase 1 ended, they captured 1,842 prisoners and killed 1,162. Phase 2 is currently in action. It began last week on the 19th and is supposed to run until January 4th. And the main objective is the mountains around Cheonju. By this point, they've captured around 4,000 men and killed another 4,000. I am aware that these numbers altogether are higher than Hermes' estimated total of 8,000 guerrillas total, but there you have it. As you may have guessed, with the war entering into a static phase, casualties have dropped dramatically. Hermes' numbers for this are that the estimates of the communist casualties fall from 80,000 in October to 50,000 in November to 20,000 this month. UN casualties have dropped from 11,000 in October to 3,000 last month and 3,000 again this month. The sinking casualty figures could have a number of end results: an expanding replacement pool, a cutback in the number of replacements requisitioned each month to keep the frontline units up to strength, or the initiation of a rotation program to relieve frontline troops. The communists decided on the first course of action in their desire to improve their position vis-a-vis the UN command. From a low of 377,000 on November 1st, the Chinese communists grew to an estimated 570,000 on the 1st of December, and a total of 642,000 by the 1st of the year. The North Koreans merely maintained their forces about 225,000 men from then until now. So, aside from nighttime patrols and a few platoon-sized attacks, the UN guys stay for the most part in their heated shelters, sitting out the Korean winter. As US 2nd Division Deputy Commander Bull Boatner says, it was as easy and plush a winter as could be expected in combat. The division took an average of only 2 casualties a day, and that was peanuts. But consider this. By any standard of actual war, peanuts it was. Yet human lives are not peanuts. And it was now almost 1952, an election year. A good argument could be made that the men who died now online in Korea died for nothing, and Washington was adamant that none must die if it could so be ordered. This is why such attacks there are only platoon-sized, because anything larger must be approved by Corps, and Corps does not wish to approve such attacks. Who is running the patrols? That is the non-coms, and they are well wise to the new nature of this war. Of the thousands of patrols run, few ever actually make contact with the enemy. The journals record this lack of contact, and also that when contact is made, it is most often initiated by the enemy. That's different, though, when it comes to artillery. The UN regularly shells the communist side behind their lines, but the reverse is not true. They have plenty of artillery, sure, but they have to bring the ammunition over a long and treacherous route. So they do not fire on things they cannot physically see and on targets that are, let's say, unprofitable. In that Fehrenbach book, I read that when the U.S. 23rd Infantry took over a section of the front from 27th, 23rd Commander James Adams was told the Chinese to the north would not shoot their big guns at traffic on the road unless 3 or more vehicles were on the road together near the front. 1 or 2 was fine to run up and down the road as much as you like and whenever you like, but not 3. That pulls the plug. Well, after a few days of no enemy artillery fire, he figured it was just a line and went up the road in a convoy of 3 jeeps. I imagine you can guess what happened. He ended up in hospital, and soon Boatner himself comes down to take control of the regiment. So, as Christmas arrives, Boatner is in charge of the 23rd. This story is also from Fehrenbach. There has been talk that there is to be an enemy attack that day, but at 10 a.m., Boatner goes to inspect the lines, and in one sector does not find one single man on the line. He goes into a platoon command post, heated, where there is an enlisted man by the phone and tells him to call the platoon leader. The guy says, well, the phone's out of order. Boatner puts the platoon leader, a second lieutenant, under arrest, and then a bit later phones his battalion commander. Boatner says, you hear about this, Colonel? The reply, hear about it? Hell, the whole regiment's heard about it, General. Don't come up here. Everybody's running for their holes. Boatner tells him to chew out the platoon leader, but release him from arrest. Then, a few days later, Boatner is in a bunker with the same second lieutenant, and there has been some heavy shelling, and when it stops, the young guy heads for the exit. Boatner asks where he's going, and the guy says he's got to make his shell report, which involves inspecting craters and reporting the number and caliber of shells. Boatner goes with him, and the second lieutenant gets wounded, leaving Boatner wondering if he hasn't almost been hoisted by his own petard. But hey, back to the expiration of the 1-month time limit of the truce line and with no armistice in sight. How do the delegates react to that? Well, they just seem to ignore it, and it sort of renews. They have a lot of other stuff on their plates, and, well, that formerly important milestone seems just that. Formerly important. This was such a big deal, with all the back and forth between Ridgway and the Joint Chiefs. But what else to do? Stop everything and negotiate a new line for some other period of time? Seems kind of wishy-washy. Thing is, there's something in the background here that the powers that be think far more important. See, Washington does not believe that any inspection process after any armistice will ensure against further enemy attacks. In November in Paris, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a joint declaration that any post-armistice expansion of the war would lead to direct UN attacks against mainland China. Then in Rome later in the month, the British Chiefs of Staff met with Acheson and U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett. Acheson felt it might be impossible to reach an armistice agreement that would provide for a truly adequate inspection system. Lovett added that no inspection limited to Korea would ensure against a renewal of the war, since the major communist bases were north of the Yalu. What Acheson asked of the British was a joint declaration threatening reprisals if the Chinese broke the armistice. The British seemed more sympathetic to bombing Manchuria than to a naval blockade. We shall see how this develops as 1952 rolls in, for I have now reached the end of the last episode, well, the last full week, of 1951. Negotiations seem like they're not going to produce an armistice anytime soon. The POW issue is cloudier than ever, but there are no big or even medium-sized offensives being planned. And on Christmas Day, 8th Army celebrates Christmas with turkeys cooked all along the front for the men. A heavy snowfall that night prevents any patrols on Boxing Day, so everyone on both sides pretty much gets a day off from the war. And Christmas comes, and Christmas goes once again. For the second time this war, though I think we all remember how the UN, especially the US, forces said last year they'd be home by last Christmas. So what has happened this Christmas, Christmas 1951? In Britain, there's a film adaptation of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol that looks like it might become a classic. Same can be said in the States for that great new Perry Como song, It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Christmas. Catchy tune, huh? Yeah? You can answer. It's okay.
Sorry.
It is catchy too. Of course, the holiday spirit seems somewhat absent in Los Angeles, as 7 civilians are badly beaten by the Los Angeles police on Christmas Day. Those 7 men were drinking in a bar on Christmas Eve, and 2 officers responded to a report that they were minors. The men proved they were not minors, but the officers told them to leave the bar. Things escalated when they refused, leading to a fight in the parking lot, in which the 2 cops suffered minor injuries. Christmas morning, 6 of the civilians were arrested at their homes and taken to jail. The 7th was dragged to a squad car by his hair, taken to a park, and beaten so badly he had multiple facial fractures and required 2 blood transfusions. He might have been the luckiest of the 7. The other 6 are taken from their jail cells and lined up. They then spend the next 90 minutes being beaten by as many as 50 police officers, and all of them suffering major injuries like organ punctures and facial fractures. And why am I telling you this? What does this have to do with the Korean War? Well, it's the world we live in, right? And it's important to remember that wars and hatred are not just faraway things that you can turn a blind eye to and just forget about. But ideally, that's what these larger wars are fought for. So people at home, around the world, won't have the tiny local wars, ideally. But maybe that's coming. Maybe it's just over the horizon in 1952, huh? Well, whatever the case, whoever and wherever you are, have a Merry Christmas, have happy holidays, and if you don't happen to have holidays, may you have peace in your heart.